Good afternoon to all of our teachers who are listening today. And I also want to thank our superintendent, Dr. Selico, for allowing me this time of personal development, and also Felice Willis and Sam Balders for setting this up. Today, I just want to take a moment to talk to you about culturally responsive teaching. You know, in the field of diversity, inclusion, and equity, this concept has gone a long way in preparing educators for all the different types of classroom dynamics that they may face when it comes to teaching students of varying backgrounds. So that's what we're going to do, talk about how to teach students of varying backgrounds. And so when you look at this concept, it goes beyond having an understanding of classroom composition. It actually reaches further on a higher level by the teacher learning the skill and possessing the ability to read and react to challenging scenarios that stem from cultural variety and differences among students and staff in the learning environment. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So while many of us as teachers and educators are very tolerant, we're respectful of others' races, ethnicities, and backgrounds, especially of our students, that doesn't fully ensure that we have the capacity to navigate difficult situations when it comes to our competence in understanding the cultures that our students come from. Yes, our students have a culture. Now, this culture could be due to a student's race, a student's ethnicity, but it could also be due to their socioeconomic background, or even where the student or their family is from. For example, a student from the South or a student from the Southwest, from the west of the country, East Coast, their culture is different than the way people are here, maybe in the Midwest. All in all, what I'm getting at is culture can vary in many ways. So as teachers, to effectively reach our kids, to effectively do what we're asked to do, we must be cognizant of that. And the more we can identify the cultures and backgrounds of our students, the better we can find the strategies and tools to figure out the best way to teach them. Again, that's our objective. And so one of the best ways to do that is through making sure that we are culturally competent. So what is cultural competence, which is going to be our first question of the day. What does that mean? What does cultural competence mean? You know, the National Educators Association does a great job of defining cultural competence, and we'll use their definition right now. Cultural competence is having an awareness of one's own cultural identity and views about difference, and the ability to learn and build on the varying cultural and community norms of students and their families. So it is the ability to understand the within-group differences that make each student unique while celebrating the between-group variations that make our world basically a tapestry. So let's dig into that. I know that was a big definition. How can our better understanding of our cultural identity of ourselves and also our views regarding cultures mixed with us learning and making ourselves more competent about the culture of our students and their families, how can that help us in the classroom? Now, I know that was a lot, but we're going to get into it. So let's go into this scenario that may help us understand how this could work. This will just make it plain as you need it to be. So now many of us have scenarios in our classroom every single day. Difficult choices, situations regarding our students, regarding their parents, regarding their behavior, and the results of that behavior. Think about that. We all go through that in the classroom. So cultural responsive teaching can help us understand these issues that we face and help us determine basically the best course of action in dealing with that particular situation. And that's what it's all about, trying to figure out the best way to deal with these scenarios. So here's an example. Imagine you're a teacher. You're working full-time in a culturally diverse 8th grade classroom. You have a fantastic relationship with your students, and you celebrate the differences among the students in your classroom every single day. You're good about that. But here's a scenario. Think about this. You're coming up in the near future is going to be a class trip to D.C., and so the kids will be staying at the hotel, traveling on the bus, and the whole 9 yards. However, you have one student who's a recent immigrant from Syria who hasn't turned in their parent permission slip yet. When you remind them to bring the form in, they say they're going to do it. Now you're just a week before the class trip. The student still hasn't returned their permission slip or their money or anything. So as a result, you decide, hey, I'm going to call their mother, find out what's going on, see if I can get her permission, see if I can get her to take care of this. However, things go a little bit differently than you expected. During that phone call with the student's mother, you learn that she doesn't know about the trip. But anyways, she's chosen not to give permission for her son to attend the trip. Now you're wondering, why wouldn't she allow the son to attend? You're left feeling very confused, but mostly disappointed that one of your students who you love, who you've been teaching all year, won't be able to attend the trip with the classmates. So in the end, you accept the parent's decision, and unfortunately, the student can't go. And so you're thinking about this. What is going on? You did everything you could with the information you had to help the student be there, but you can't quite wrap your head around the choice that this student's mother made. And so that's where cultural competence comes into play. Now, here is something to think about when it comes to being a culturally competent teacher, a culturally competent educator. Think about this. What if more context and an enhanced understanding of culture would have helped your student make it onto that trip? What if you'd known that when the student's family came to the United States and joined your school, they weren't just immigrating to create a better future for themselves. They were actually escaping a traumatic past. What if you'd known that the reason that the student's family was opposed to the idea of them attending a trip and staying overnight was because the last time that that family was separated overnight was when they had been displaced at a refugee camp in Syria? Think about that. What if that was their experience? Now, while that may be a very extreme case, and most of your applications of culturally responsive teaching in the classroom won't just be like this scenario, you can clearly see how understanding the background of your student will help you teach better, help you understand them better, but will also help you to know what they may need special, what type of special help or special attention they may need. You know, the bottom line is that culture isn't going anywhere, and the gap and array of different backgrounds of students in the U.S. is only getting larger. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, you'll see that minority students account for more than half of the students in the U.S. public school system. 1 of every 5 students now speak a language other than English at home. So these numbers may not be in our district, maybe so, maybe no, but around the country they are. There's a growing number of U.S. teachers who are struggling with how they can better serve students from other cultures other than their own. And there's nothing wrong with those struggles. We just have to meet those struggles and do something about it. And so the best way to do this is to work on and learn culturally responsive teaching. Remember, when a teacher holds a high level of cultural competence and transmits this knowledge and understanding to their students and also to the students' families, what we have is culturally responsive teaching. So let's go into this a little bit, but let's get another definition of this type of teaching, and maybe it'll help us even more. Culturally responsive teaching, also called culturally relevant teaching, is a type of teaching that recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. Traditional teaching strategies emphasize the teacher-student dynamic. The teacher is the expert and adheres strictly to the curriculum that supports the standardized tests, while the student receives the knowledge. Now, this teaching method I just talked about is in many circles seen as maybe outdated. And the question is, why is it outdated? It's because of this. Think about it. It's because maybe, just maybe, teachers have more diverse classrooms today, of course. We don't have students sitting in front of us with the same backgrounds or experiences us all the time. So instruction also has to be different. And so that's what we're just kind of trying to glean into today. And so as culturally responsive teachers, it can also be manifested in different ways. Using traditional teaching methods, educators may default to teaching literature by widely accepted classic authors. Think about it. William Shakespeare, J.D. Salinger, and Charles Dickens, for example, adheres to what we call widely accepted interpretations. But culturally responsive teaching, on the other hand, acknowledges that there's nothing wrong with these traditional texts, but strives to include literature from also other cultures, maybe other parts of the world, and by diverse authors. It also focuses on finding a hook and anchor method to help draw students into the context using their past experiences. So this way, students can see themselves in some way in the reading and not just be entrenched in what we call the Western world or according to the culture that they may not know or identify with. We have to try to reach to them. Also, think about this. Culturally responsive teaching is very pertinent today because the traditional educational path from school to college to a career and life in the suburbs isn't always a reality or a desire for everyone anymore. And so as educators, our approach to teaching needs to reflect these differences. That typical mainstream education is not addressing the reality of today's students, some say. Also culturally responsive teaching isn't just for those students who don't come from white middle-class English-speaking families. It's an important teaching strategy for everyone. So when we're doing this the right way, it can be transformative. When integrated into classroom instruction, culturally responsive strategies can have important benefits. And let's talk about some of those benefits, such as it could strengthen the student's sense of identity. Think about this. Promoting equity and inclusiveness in the classroom engages students in the course material. And it also does this. It also supports critical thinking. It can be extremely powerful. Think about it. So let me give you 5 quick strategies for activating a culturally responsive classroom, or basically activating culturally responsive teaching. Here's the first step. Activate students' prior knowledge. Students are not blank slates. They enter the classroom with diverse experiences. So teachers should encourage students to draw on their prior knowledge in order to contribute to group discussions, which provides an anchor to learning. Taking a different approach to the literature that's taught in the classroom is also one example of how to do this. It's always about a different approach. Here's another strategy. Make learning contextual. Tie lessons from the curriculum to the students' social communities to make it more contextual and relevant. If you're reading a chapter in history class, for example, discuss why it matters today, why it matters in your school or in your community. Take the concept you're learning about and create basically a project that enables them to draw parallels to the work. Here's another strategy. Encourage students to leverage their cultural capital. Now, what does that mean? Think about this. Not all students come from the same background, and because of that, it's important to encourage those who don't have a voice. Say, for example, you teach an English class that contains ESL students. It's important to find ways to activate the experiences that they do have, which is basically their cultural capital. Maybe you choose a book from the class to read in which the ESL students could relate and feel like they could be the expert, for example. Think about it. Maybe you choose a book that tells the story of a child migrant, talks about child migrant workers because some of your students came from maybe an agricultural background. That's just a way to use their cultural capital. Now, when you have a mixed classroom, you want those in the minority to feel like they're an expert also. But you also want to draw from their experiences. However, this is what you don't want to do. You don't want to cross a line and make a student feel like he or she needs to speak for all of their cultural group by putting them on the spot, for example. Now, that's a line that as educators, we never want to cross. Another strategy is to reconsider your classroom setup. Take inventory of the books in your classroom. Do they include authors of diverse races? Do they have books that include maybe urban families or only suburban families? Beyond your classroom library, I want you to consider also the posters that you display on the walls, maybe your bulletin boards. These are all small changes that can make your classroom more culturally responsive. And lastly, just work to build a relationship. You want to be culturally responsive? Not all students want to learn from all teachers because the teachers may not make them feel like they're valued. As teachers, we need to work to build relationships with our students to ensure that they feel respected, valued, and seen for who they are. Building those relationships will help them build community within the classroom and with each other, which is extremely, and I'm telling you, extremely important. So these things are definitely easy to do. And so when we think about culture and diversity, people often, automatically think about Black students, but people need to think broader than that now. Some teachers whose students are all white and middle class struggle with how culturally responsive teaching strategies also apply to them. So it's equally important for them to teach students about diversity. Remember, these aren't just teaching strategies for minorities. Culturally diverse teaching is good teaching strategies for everybody. So now I'd like to end this time of personal development with a great video produced by the TED Talk series by Melissa Crum, a very well-respected and well-known educator. She speaks from the subject of A Tale of Two Teachers. Looking at some of the overreaching themes in this presentation, I want you to look at how maybe you can be a more culturally diverse teacher. And again, these talks aren't to make anyone bitter, they're to make you better. Just want to encourage you and let you know that we can all continue to work to do what's best for our students. So I want to thank you. Now we're going to get into our video.
I loved my second grade teacher. One day, it was picture day, and I completely forgot. She grabbed a comb and decided to attempt her Coretta Scott Kingish bouffant comb back thing, this side swoop. One day, I was particularly ornery, and she grabbed my wrist and said, "Melissa, you are not being your best." And I was angry. She grabbed my hand. I was gonna tell my mama. I was seething in my seat. She saw me. She called me outside, gave me a cupcake and said, "I'm sorry for grabbing your wrist, but you are not being your best. Sit out here, eat this cupcake, and join us when you're ready." Fast forward to 8th grade, and I'm sitting in my math class. My teacher comes over and gently places her hand on my shoulder, and she says to me, "You're pretty smart for a black girl." And I remember responding, "Thank you." Unsure what to do with that comment and those emotions that came with it, I went to my principal, who I had a rapport with, and I told him what happened. He sat back in his chair, he sighed, and he said, "I'll handle it." A few days later, I was in class, and she came to me with this confused face. And she said, "I'm sorry if I offended you with what I said, but I just wanted you to know that I think you're smart." And it was clear to me that she was completely unaware of how problematic her statement was, how it made me feel. A few days later, I go to my English class, where we had the results of a test that told us what reading level we were at, what grade we were reading. So in the 8th grade, I was reading at an 11th grade level. Jerry, a white boy who was sitting next to me, his test said he was reading at a 12th grade level. And I remember thinking, that must be what she means. Fast forward, my son is getting prepared to enter kindergarten, and I have a lot of anxiety around it. I wondered, how do I go about putting my son in a space to limit these types of biases, these types of interactions with teachers? So I worked with some parents to create a homeschool cooperative, where we use the information and the knowledge of the group and the resources in the community to teach our children. We started off with 2 African-American families. We blossomed to 7, then 14 children. And more people continued to inquire about what we're doing and asking us how to be a part. Then I began to wonder, why did they want to be in a cooperative in the first place? What was the impetus that made them want to remove their children from traditional schools? So I asked the parents. Then I asked African-American families who were homeschooling across the nation. And one thing remained consistent. Every family who decided to homeschool their children either had a negative interaction with the teacher when they were students, or a negative interaction with the teacher from their children. So what we find, research tells us that teachers' histories are important when it comes to the classroom. They bring those stories that guide how they choose curriculum, how they choose to teach, and how they interact with their students. what we also know is that we have to be careful about how we interact with our children and how we think about the work that we're doing with them. So I began to wonder, how do those microscopic interactions with teachers that have that underlying bias, how might that be replicated or manifest in macroscopic situations? How might these interactions be supported in state and federal policies that affect education? So we know that African American children, particularly boys, are disproportionately disciplined. They're giving more suspensions than their white counterparts for the same infractions. We know that African American children are disproportionately placed in special education. They're also disproportionately medicated in the school system. We also know that states like Alabama, Virginia, and my home state of Florida has race-based academic standards. Let that sit for a moment. Race-based academic standards. So what that means is a white child may be required to pass at 80%, where a black child is required to pass at 60%. So what does that mean for our children? Who are we telling who can and can't be intelligent? How are we preparing our children for the next grade, for college? I then began to look at teacher demographics and student demographics. So I looked at who's in this classroom, right? So we know that children of color have doubled in the last 30 years in the K-12 system. We know that 22% of children live in poverty. And we know that 10% of students in the K-12 system are English language learners. Yet, our teacher workforce remains predominantly female, white, middle class, and monolingual English speakers. We also know that there's challenges around retention in urban and rural areas where this diversity is most concentrated. So universities and teacher preparation programs have recognized this. They've created diversity training programs, which generally are categorized in 3 different categories. First is conservative, in which teachers are told that children should be assimilating into mainstream norms and removing any cultural differences. Liberal, which tells teachers to tolerate difference. And third, and the least utilized, is critical. Critical requires teachers to investigate the influences of power, oppression, dominance, and inequity that manifests in the classroom and extends into federal policies. So who's doing this? Who's able to think about these large macroscopic issues and make them relatable and digestible to a lay audience? Artists and museum educators. I argue that when we incorporate art, critical self-reflection, storytelling, and peer dialogue into professional development, we prepare teachers to be better leaders as they reflect on their own biases that they bring into the classroom. That increases their engagement and strong relationships with their students and have higher academic achievement in the classroom. So let's take this image. I ask teachers, what do you see? Oftentimes they say, I see 2 black male figures, maybe 2 friends, maybe a father and son. Then I say, tell me a little bit about them. Who are they? I get a myriad of stories. But I always get, something isn't right here. Something's wrong. They're up to something. They're violent. Then I say, what do you see that makes you say that? And oftentimes, they can't put their finger on what exactly they see, what exactly evoked that emotion. But as we go through this inquiry-based process, what those teachers tend to find is that they have deep-seated stories about who these black boys are or aren't. In the same way they brought those stories to this painting, they bring those stories to those boys that show up in their classes. Critically conscious museum educators are experts at having this inquiry-based interaction. They're great at having this dialogue around images that encompass these large issues. They're able to create engaging and participatory activities that make the complex simple. They can harness that learning power within museums, and they can do it within an hour. My colleague, Kiona Hendrick, and I created a process called Multicultural Critical Reflective Practice. It's an ongoing process that asks teachers to identify, analyze, and challenge those cultural beliefs, values, and assumptions that color their interactions with their students. It can't be boxed. It's a blend of different approaches. We ask these teachers to confront their preconceived notions that guide their relationships with their students. It's an uncomfortable session. We bring up these emotions and these deep-seated stories that they didn't realize they had. We evoke emotions for change. We believe when you feel it, you can identify it, you have something to hold on to, something you can change. So what happens when we incorporate the works of Emory Douglas, or Kehinde Wiley, or Micheline Thomas, or Titus Kafour, or Wanjechi Mutu? What happens when we get these images to ask people, to ask our teachers, to dig into the deep recesses of their minds and harness those problematic concepts that they've been socialized and been told to internalize? Well, we found that it's working. As we're doing this work across the country with educators, they're better prepared to have conversations around race, sexuality, gender, cultural differences. Professors are better equipped to teach their teachers to have these engaging and conscious interactions with their students. And K through 12 teachers more conscious about their curriculum choices and their interactions with their students. So what happens? We know when we engage students, we lessen dropout rates. We increase academic performance. When we have a more intellectual workforce, we know that we have more productive citizens. So what happens when we ask social workers, nonprofit leaders, police officers to do this critical self-reflection? To ask them to critically think about the communities they've been charged to help, support, and protect. Maybe we get people like my second grade teacher. Miss Whitehurst, I don't know where you are right now, but I thank you. I thank you for telling me to be my best and expecting nothing less. I thank you for seeing my humanness and complexity. I thank you for helping me see and believe in what you saw in me. Thank you.